Thank you very much for being allowed to be here today and discuss about this. I think it will be preaching for the converted, but maybe there'll be some points along the way that is somewhat different to the debate. First of all, there is a kind of upfront discussion here, namely the fact that over a very long time, numerous studies have shown that deep renovation of buildings is the low-cost option to deal with energy and climate policy issues. That has been said already many times before, so there's nothing new to this. But in this study, we also then start with the premise that now if there's been a time for starting this should be now. And I think the presentation from Cohesion basically just outlines some basic interesting perspective of this. For the last many years, the construction sector has been very much occupied by doing everything else, including a lot of new buildings. In some countries, unfortunately, far too many buildings. So there's a huge capacity in the construction sector to start doing this work now. And unfortunately, it's not just in the construction sector. There's a lot of spare capacity. There is a lot of spare capacity in our economies as a whole. So there's a big hole to be filled in here. And this is indicated in this slide that shows that unemployment rate has been increasing. And if you look at the most recent forecasts from the OECD, from the European Commission, the unfortunate situation of far too many idle hands is something that will continue for some years still. A second observation that is also linked to the severity of the economic crisis is the very fact that borrowing costs for the far majority of consumers, investors, and even governments in Europe is an all-time low. It's right that there are problems in the countries facing big sovereign debt problems, but the far majority of member state investors, consumers, and governments is in a situation where the cost of financing investment is an all-time low. Something happened there. Okay. So, the basic three premises is here. We know the benefits are there. The capacity is there. Far too much capacity, in fact, and it has never been so cheap. What's happening here? Someone can help me? Okay, so next picture. What we're showing here is the multiple benefits of energy renovation. First of all, they are in two dimensions. There are larger gains to society. The gains to society are direct. If you put in place investments, the cost of which are lower than the benefits, then of course you're saving money. That is the value of energy savings. In addition to that, numerous studies have shown that there are indirect benefits in terms of improved indoor climate and reductions of air pollution, and that is linked, first of all, to the fact that the main energy source in Europe still is fossil-based sources. So there are these multiple benefits, and what we are suggesting is, so these are, let's say, the gains to society, but there's also gains to public finances, and that is a very important discussion in the context of whether there are obstacles in terms of financing to this. And the first conclusion here is that, as also indicated again by the presentation from Croatia, a lot of these energy savings are going to take place in public buildings. So the primary beneficiary of such investment will be treasuries, local governments, public enterprises, and so on and so forth. So clearly, there's a direct benefit to the treasuries ultimately. We also say that there are some other kinds of impacts. Some of these have been alluded to already in the German presentation, that given the fact that the energy savings is the low-cost option to deliver on climate energy goals, it means that some of the more expensive ones can be avoided, and some of these monies can be then used for all the nice things we want to do in low-carbon technologies and so on and so forth. So there's here a huge opportunity to do something better with public funds. And also, and we're coming back to this, the fact is that if you can do something now in a situation where there's a lot of spare capacity, the economies can benefit from higher tax revenues, from corporate taxes, income taxes, so on and so forth, and reduce expenditure to unemployment benefits, social expenditures. Now, to fill out the spaces here, we have looked at a very wide-ranging study being undertaken by the Commission. So here we not did any kind of original research, but very thorough work done by Fraunhofer, which is in line with a number of other studies that has looked at the energy savings potential across the entire EU. And in this, they have identified two kinds of scenarios. A scenario where they look at the real most cost-efficient energy savings, and then a second scenario where they take more energy savings that are, let's say, more on the margin, but still might be viable, and particularly viable if you look at the alternatives in the area of energy and climate policies. Then we have tried to run these two scenarios against what they could mean in terms of benefits to society. And the basic fact is here that the sort of the scenario with the least ambitious scope could generate benefits in the area of 100 billion euros by 2020, and that is yearly benefits in 2020. And if you take the more ambitious one, an even larger number. So these are really large benefits to society. And remember again, these are benefits that are not, as a basic premise, not based on governments having to come up with a lot of money to reach these benefits. These are projects that have a very good viability on their own. And there, the second thing we've done is to look at the public benefits from this, public finance benefits of this, excluding, in the first case, effects on GDP, saved expenditure to social security, and increased revenues. We're just looking at the more direct effects. And of course, the most direct effect is how much governments can save on their own energy bill. And they also can save some money on subsidies to renewable energy that can be used for other energy purposes. We're also saying here, though, that if there is lower energy use, there's also lower income from energy taxes. Now, this is not a loss to society because that is just a transfer from let's say, consumers to the government, but it's very important to keep track of what is happening with public finances. But the main point here is that the loss of revenues from energy taxes is dwarfed by the more larger direct benefits that the government gets as owner of these buildings and other avoided expenditure. So the basic net benefits could be around 30 billion euros, which is a large sum that could come in handy for a number of governments in Europe who is certainly in need of money. And of course, the money will be even bigger if we go for the more ambitious scenario. Now, the second point, which I think is particular, or the next round of arguments, which are, I think, particularly valid at the current situation, is that when we look forward at scenarios of growth in Europe, we see that we'll have another 3, 4, 5 years before we are getting back to, let's say, a normal situation with normal capacity utilization where there's not a lot of slack in the labor market. In this period, any stimulus to the economy would have an additional value to society. That's obvious. These people will not get easily a new job. That's the whole point of showing scenarios that has weak growth. These people will be unemployment unless something is done. And here we have an option to give people a job that is highly viable to society, that brings net benefits to consumers. So this is a time to do this, and it brings in money. And what we are suggesting here is that the calculation we've done is using standard techniques to evaluate how much money government gets in if you have a push to the economy. And what we are suggesting here is that if you look at the entire period where we think growth is still far too weak to get us back to a normal situation, the benefits could reach up to 150 billion, or maybe even up to 300 billion. That's a lot of money. These are, I just want to repeat here, is not gains. These kind of gains are not permanent gains in the sense that when it comes to 2020, 2025, I hope, God, that we're having a more normal situation where one more job in the construction industry is not necessarily a new job for the total economy, but is a good job, a deserved job, but not something that brings net jobs. But the next 5 years, I think we're in a situation that if we can create jobs through deep renovation, these will be, to a substantial extent, new jobs to the economy. And that is basically what these calculations measure. Now, we also, in the study, provided some overview of where are these energy savings to be had, and that's based on the Fraunhofer study, which has identified savings potential across Europe. And there's, of course, a certain link between the size of the economy and the size of the benefits they can have. But there are also certainly variations from that theme. Countries that has a very old building stock or other regulatory framework that prevents energy efficiency take place will have a larger potential, and vice versa. Germany comes out here as a country that has a huge potential and larger than its share of GDP. That's just going in line with the presentation we had from the speaker from the European Parliament. What we don't have in the study is the gains to public finances or society from improved health and air pollution, because we don't have the sources to provide these kind of gains. And also, just to a bit of a digression here, is that, for example, air pollution in Denmark is not directly linked so much to energy savings in Denmark, but energy savings in UK, because the wind comes from the west and we are depending on that. And we could do something for air pollution in Sweden because the wind continues to Sweden. So it's a much more difficult exercise to find out who actually gains from air pollution. The only thing is we can say is that if the entire energy consumption in Europe based on fossil fuels production goes down, then the cost of air pollution will go down as well for EU citizens and those living to the east of Europe. Now, here comes maybe something where we go slightly in a different direction than some of the previous speakers. What we emphasize in this study, and I think that's a very important point if you want to convince people who are sitting tightly on the purse, that a number of the barriers, maybe the most important structural barriers that prevents these projects to go forward, are regulatory barriers. Because you have to ask yourself, if projects are so hugely profitable, why are they not going ahead? Now, there is, of course, a discussion of lack of finance, energy economics being spread in small sums and no one actually picking up the money lying on the floor. But what we also need to recognize is that there are key structural barriers holding back investments. One of the big barriers is, to be honest, rent regulation. There is a huge spread bad regulation in Europe that basically prevents the landlord from financing investments that brings benefits to the tenant, and then tell the tenant, shouldn't we split the gain so that I can get recuperation of some of the investment costs and you get a lower energy bill? That should be, a no-brainer in the sense that both comes out of the door better off than what went through the door in the first place. But that's not legal. In my own country, we've had I think 1.5 years ago, a law that actually allowed this to take place in social housing. And now, 2nd of October, the government presented a bill suggesting that also in private buildings, this should take place for the first time. Now, this is not something that has been done to harm energy efficient buildings. This is simply a fact of the way rent regulation is put together. And obviously, without opening up the whole framework of rent regulation, you could at least make sure that targeted investments that can bring down costs to the tenants can be recuperated to the benefit of both. Big barrier across Europe, and we have some evidence for that in our report. Secondly, and that has been alluded to clearly also in some of the previous interventions, that we have in place a structure of public management that actually has very narrow focus on next year's cash flows as opposed to the longer run viability of local and central government. And we need to solve that problem. It cannot be true that a local government or local enterprise cannot get a finance that can reduce long-term cost of running that enterprise due to misaligned investment restrictions and so on and so forth. Now, the reason why ministries of finance, and I used to work for the Ministry of Finance, is against these kind of things is always, well, we can give people this money, but no, are we ever getting them back, and they're going to misspend them and so forth. I think we need to break through these barriers and get this solved because the benefits are there, and at the end of the day, the treasury should save money, the consumers should save money, so get this going. But it's not going to be easy, and I think the presentations have underlined that. The third argument here is also a bit of line with the discussion of the ETS, that we have in a number of countries tax provisions that specifically lower the cost to consumers, private consumers, of using energy. And that, of course, weakens incentives to energy efficiency. Now, these rules are typically in place to protect low-income families. But the point is here that we should separate social policy from energy policy. It's not, again, it's a no-brainer to say that low-income families should be protected from the cost of removing these subsidies. But it's no way, it's not very smart to have a social policy that is based in encouraging energy consumption. Again, doing this will actually provide net benefits to consumers because those who are going to be protected from this are low-income families. High-income families should not get a support to their energy bill. The fourth one is, and that's linked to some of the earlier discussions here, that obviously we have in a number of cases, in that particular for what we call we call deep renovation projects, there's a huge amount of upfront costs. And the benefit will show over time. So we see a development in new kind of programs, and I think the Cohesion speaker was very eloquent on that. But this is a new thing, but it needs to develop, put in practice, tested, and so on and so forth. And these kind of projects are more easily implemented in some situations than other situations. But this is an issue that needs to be pushed, and I think this is an area where the government could put in some money to push this forward. But I think if you take all 4 barriers together and implement these 4 barriers, the ministries of finance and local governments are going to earn money. They're going to earn money. And you can actually construct it so they earn money from the first day if you allocate risks and payment schedules in the right way. So, what are the conclusions? My conclusion from this is that we know that deep renovation is very energy efficient. We also know that so it pays for itself, and even more so when you look at the kind of ambitious climate goals EU has going forward, there'll be a very increasingly attractive option compared to alternatives. It also have sizable co-benefits. These have been measured in a number of studies, which add to the arguments for doing something like this. So we think this is the perfect time to do it. We have the spare resources. We have the low finance costs. So the timing is obvious. We know what the barriers are. They're well identified. Deal with them. And what are the outcomes here? I don't see any single loser. Public treasuries are going to gain. Consumers are going to gain. Producers are going to gain. So why not do it? And that would be my final remark. Thank you very much.